in the way you help others, so you can live your.
Hi, Tony.
Hi there, how are you?
How are you?
Hey.
Still letting a few people in the waiting room, so we'll get started in a few minutes.
Okay, no problem.
Right. No.
Hi, Donna.
We missed last week, but Kayla recorded it, so we got to watch it. So
We're recording today already, so get ready. All right, it is 2:30 on the nose, so we will let Tony get started. Tony, take it away.
Okay, let's see here. I don't know exactly what I'm doing here. Okay, so am I spotlighted?
yes,
Okay, here we go. Well, I'm trying to find my where where I can share. I seem to be missing
At
something
the
here.
bottom, a green button.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Okay, I think we're ready to go now. Well, welcome back. We're doing a presentations on ancient history in the Bible. And we've been talking for the last few weeks about ancient Egypt, and we're going to pretty much finish that up today. Boy, it's not a very pretty day here in the Ozarks. It's overcast, it's gloomy, it's drizzly, it's in the 50s, and very windy. And on top of that, I'm a little groggy because I stayed up and watched my Kansas City Chiefs just absolutely get shellacked last night by the Buffalo Bills. So if I kind of stutter around, you'll know why. So let's kind of review what we did last week. We learned that King Ahmose expelled the Hyksos invaders early, and then reunited Egypt during this new period of Egypt's history known as the New Kingdom. And we learned that the New Kingdom ushered in a new dynasty of kings, which became known as pharaohs. Up to this point, they'd just been called kings, but now we call them pharaohs. And of course, now in history, we pretty much give that title to all the Egyptian kings. We learned that Queen Hatshepsut, who may have been the daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter who, basically rescued Moses, was one of the most powerful and also one of the only really two women who held the throne of Egypt. She was a very unique character, as we talked about last week. We learned that her son, Thutmose III, sometimes called the Napoleon of Egypt, was a military genius, transformed Egypt into an ancient superpower. And we learned that his son, Amenhotep II, may well have been the Pharaoh of Moses that we hear in the Bible. That's up to dispute. Some people still maintain it was Ramesses II, which we're going to talk about very briefly today. But the kind of consensus in history has been recently that it's probably Amenhotep II. We also learned that Amenhotep II's successors raised Egypt's fortunes to an unprecedented time of prosperity and peace. So that's what we learned last week. So let's see what we can talk about today. We're going to talk primarily about three pharaohs: Akhenaten, King Tutankhamun, usually called King Tut, and Ramesses II, who very well may have been the Pharaoh of Moses. We just are unsure. So who was Akhenaten and what made him so important? Well, he was born Amenhotep. He was the grandson of Amenhotep II, who would have been probably the Pharaoh of Moses. And he became a pharaoh because his older brother had died before succeeding to the throne. We don't really know very much about him, except we know that he married his thought to be full sister Nefertiti. Now remember, folks, this is very common in Egyptian royal life. They thought they were divine, the pharaohs, and in order to pass that lineage on, they had to marry another divine person, which could only be normally their full sister. So it was not uncommon for brothers to marry full sisters amongst the ancient pharaohs. This is one reason you had a change in lineage so frequently, because obviously the genetics being what they may, they probably suffered from some genetic abnormalities down the line. It's thought that he served a short co-regency with his father, and upon ascending the throne as sole pharaoh, he followed the traditional pharaonic policies, which included worshiping many gods, monotheism. He did all the things that pharaohs were supposed to do. But then something happened, and we really don't know what happened. But about 4 years into his reign, he began to change. One of the first things he did, he ordered a new temple complex built at Karnak, which was kind of the main temple complex for Egypt. And it was dedicated solely to Aten, which was the sun disk, not the sun itself, but the actual disk. And up to that point, Amun-Ra, the sun, was supposed to be the kind of the chief god of Egypt. All of a sudden, he kind of starts focusing in on this one god. And then suddenly records show he changed his name. He was no longer called Amenhotep. He was called Akhenaten, which basically reflected his worship of this disk of the sun. And then he began to build a new capital at a little town called Amarna. And it was quickly built, and it was out in the middle of nowhere, frankly. It was the middle of the desert. And it was almost like he wanted to isolate himself. And it was from this new city of Amarna that he would revolutionize Egypt's traditional religion by declaring Aten was the only god, and the rest of the long-held pantheon of Egyptian gods were non-existent. In other words, folks, he overnight changed Egypt's religion from polytheistic, many, many gods. Remember, I told you there may be thousands of gods in Egypt. All of a sudden, he said, these gods no longer exist. They never did exist. There's only one God, the sun disk. Wow, you talk about a revolution. That was a revolution to Egypt, because their whole society was built upon the worship of these gods, as we've talked about. So this is Akhenaten. You can notice that he was portrayed extremely realistically. He's not the typical bust of an Egyptian pharaoh, which are always portrayed as muscular and strong and youthful. his busts are portrayed extremely realistically, pot belly and all. That is his wife's sister, Nefertiti, to his right. Nefertiti's bust is one of the most famous pieces of sculpture to come out of ancient Egypt. It's located now in the museum in Berlin, Germany, and it's something that most people have seen at one time or the other in photographs, and it's an extremely famous bust of sculpture. That was his sister. That was his wife. So from Armana, he began to worship a monotheistic religion. Now, it can't be coincidence that this happened about the time of Moses. Now, whether it was Amenhotep II was Moses' Pharaoh, or whether it was Ramesses II, there's only a distance of about 200 years here. We can't prove a connection between the two. There's just no definite proof. But you almost know that Akhenaten would have had to been familiar with Moses if indeed Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of Moses. He would have had to have heard about Moses. It would have been one of those stories that was passed down amongst the pharaohs about this guy leading all these plagues and then leading the Hebrews out of Egypt. On the other hand, if it was Ramesses, then it would have been too early for him to know that. But he most certainly would have known of the monotheistic religion of the Hebrews, because they made up an extremely large portion of the workforce of Egypt. So there's no doubt that there had to be a knowledge between Akhenaten and the monotheistic religion of the Hebrews. How that influenced Akhenaten, we were probably never going to know, because we have no connection now between the two. But it can't be just pure coincidence that two of the only monotheistic religions of the ancient world happen to happen around each other in a matter of almost a couple of hundred years. It's almost impossible to imagine that there was not some kind of connection there. Now, we know a whole lot about Akhenaten's rule during the Armana period, because he wrote a lot of letters, and these are called the Armana letters, and they have been preserved for the most part. And as a result, we know a whole lot about what he did. We know that even though he was focused on this monotheistic religion, that he nevertheless still maintained an interest in foreign policy. He was concerned about all the things that were going on. There's a little bit of an indication he was a pacifist, that he really wasn't too much on waging war. Now, it goes without saying that the priests of the many religious temples that were found all over Egypt were not happy with Akhenaten, because all of a sudden they're out of a job, folks. Their livelihood depended upon sacrifices being given to them, and a certain percentage of the crops and all the gold and stuff that the people found had to be given to the priest of the certain temples. And all of a sudden, they're out of a job. So you can only imagine that they were not happy with Akhenaten. In fact, they were extremely unhappy with him. But there wasn't much they could do. After all, the Pharaoh was pretty strong. So all they could hope was that maybe he wouldn't live long. And indeed, he did not live long. He only lived about 17 years into his reign. And it's possible that his royal wife, Nefertiti, ruled for a very short period of time, but not very probable. What happened was, after he died, he was succeeded by Tutankhamun, King Tut. Now, was that his son? We don't really know for sure. We know they were related. They've done genetic studies upon the mummies of Akhenaten and King Tut, and there is definitely a genetic relationship between the two. Whether or not that was a father-son relationship or a nephew relationship or what, we don't know. Frankly, the family tree of Egypt's kings, pharaohs were so messed up. I don't know that we would have known even if we had it written down. It was just such a mess. But we know this: the monotheistic reforms started a gradual decline in Egypt's governmental power. Once Akhenaten did this, even though it didn't last, but his reign, it put such a doubt in the minds of the Egyptian people that it began a slow decline of the standing of the Pharaoh in Egypt's social and religious life. So here's a engraving, a monument of Akhenaten worshiping the sun disk. And he said, this is the only God. All those other gods, Horus, Set, Osiris, Isis, all those gods we've talked about in the past, they didn't exist. Those guys were just fooling you. The only God that exists was the sun disk. Well, of course, that didn't last. It only lasted as long as he did. And as soon as he died, then the royal court put Tutankhamun, King Tut, into his place. Now, King Tut is one of the ironies of history. Egyptian history is just absolutely full of powerful kings. And yet, the most remembered king of Egypt, the most remembered Pharaoh of Egypt, assumed the crown as a child. He accomplished almost nothing, and he died barely out of adolescence. I've told other people that he was the Millard Fillmore of Egyptian pharaohs. If you don't know who Millard Fillmore was, don't be surprised, but he was the president of the United States. And nobody remembers Millard Fillmore. Everybody knows Lincoln, everybody knows Washington, everybody knows FDR, everybody knows Kennedy. We all know the great presidents of American history. Nobody knows Millard Fillmore. And Tutankhamun, King Tut, was the Millard Fillmore of Egyptian pharaohs. He was a nobody, and yet he is the one that we all remember, because out of the hundreds of pharaohs, when they finally discovered his tomb, his was the only one that was intact, that had not been robbed. And the result was there were treasures just unbelievable came out of his tomb. And as I've told other people before, if that is true, just think what the pharaohs, the big pharaohs, people like Ramesses II and Amenhotep II and Hatshepsut, think of what their tombs must have had in them. I mean, it's just unbelievable. We're going to see photographs here in a few minutes of some of the treasures and splendors that came out of King Tut's tomb, and they're just phenomenal. And so if he was just a nobody, imagine what the other ones that were really big and powerful must have been like. So it's a unique story in itself, how he became a pharaoh. So this is his golden mask that was found. That is solid gold with lapis-lazuli, the blue stuff in it, and jewels. It's that's not wooden gilt or anything like that. That's solid gold. That thing is no telling how many billions of dollars worth it is. All, by the way, all of King Tut's treasures are in the Cairo Museum now. King Tut becomes pharaoh. Well, here's how that happened. Around the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, his chief wife died, followed by his second wife. He had no sons, and he was frantic to have a son because that was important for, to follow in the lineage. So what he did was he impregnated all three of his daughters and hopes that they would have a son. But lo and behold, every one of his daughters had daughters. So he ended up with 6 daughters, no sons. And when he died, there was absolutely no male heir to follow in his footsteps, at least not a royal heir. Now, at that point, the courtiers around, the ones around Akhenaten, decided they were going to pick out somebody, and they were going to crown the next pharaoh. And so they picked out Tutankhamun, the 9-year-old boy. The vizier, the chief of staff, a man by the name of I, kind of acted as his co-regent. Now, again, we don't know exactly the relationship between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. They were related. There was, genetic similarity. There's a connection there. We just don't know exactly where he came from. We do know this: Tutankhamun married Akhenaten's youngest wife, daughter, whatever you want to call her. Her name was Akhenaten, and she had already produced an heir for King Akhenaten, and so it's just a weird relationship going on here, to say the least. Tutankhamun, and that was his name originally because he was named after the sun disk, immediately had his name changed to Tutankhamun, the worship of the sun, the traditional sun, not the sun disk, the Aten. He excised Akhenaten's name off all the monuments. He ordered his statues destroyed, most of them. He ordered the capital to be moved back to Thebes. He re-endowed all the priests and ended the worship of the sun disk. In other words, he restored basically the old rituals of, the Egyptian religion. Now, I say he did. He was a 9-year-old boy. He didn't have much to say about it. I and all the other courtiers basically said, this is what you're going to do, because they were in charge at this point, and King Tut was just a placeholder. So they went back and basically did away with all of Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution and put in place the old rituals. Now, Tutankhamun was not a boy. His mummy has obviously been found. It's been thoroughly examined, and we know he was not well from his birth. He had a cleft palate. He had scoliosis. He had a club foot, which probably necessitated him walking with a cane, several of which were found in his tomb. He had a very unusual physique, very narrow waist, very rounded hip. And a lot of people suspect that he suffered from something called Marfan Syndrome, which produces extremely elongated fingers and just kind of an androgynous type body. And this would have not been unusual. Remember that statue I showed you of Akhenaten? It almost seemed like he might have inherited some of Akhenaten's physical deformities. He had long limbs and elongated fingers and legs and arms, and kind of a big belly with rounded hips and a sunken-in chest. All this kind of resembled something called Marfan disease, which is a genetic problem. He also suffered from malaria, but probably what killed him was an infection. He probably fractured a leg. We know he fractured a leg sometime right before his death, and it had not healed completely, and there's every possibility that he probably died from an infection at the age of 19. He was only a 19-year-old boy when he died. And so again, he died very young. Now, for a long time, they thought that he was killed because his skull was fractured in the back. And people thought, I and some of the other guys clubbed him in the head and killed him. Well, we know now from more study of the mummy that was all post-mortem. Probably what happened was they cracked the back of his skull open to get the brain out. Remember, they didn't think the Egyptians didn't think the brain was anything. And so they didn't leave it in the body like they did other vital organs. They thought it was just nothing. And so they pulled it out and threw it away. And that's probably why he had a fractured skull. Bottom line is, King Tut was not a well person. He suffered a myriad of genetic diseases, had medical problems throughout his short life. So again, folks, we're talking about basically a young adolescent that was basically put in place as a pharaoh. And the only reason we even know anything about him is because we found his tomb unplundered. And that in itself is a story. This is King Tut's mummy. If you ever wonder what a mummy looks like with all the wrappings undone and all, that's a mummy right there. Kind of a gruesome looking thing. but that's it. Now, let's look at the story of the discovery of the tomb, because that in itself is an unbelievable story. By 1914, the Valley of the Kings, where most of the modern pharaohs had been buried, had pretty much been excavated. And so most of the famous archaeologists had kind of left the Valley of the Kings. And so there wasn't much there, but there was an amateur English lord. His name was George Herbert. He was called the Earl of Carnarvon. He was just, he had a lot of money, and he was kind of he wanted to see if he could find anything. So he hired a young Egyptologist by the name of Howard Carter. And he said, I'm going to pay you money to keep excavating the Valley of Kings. Maybe you can find something. And so Howard Carter and Carnarvon started a 7-year bout trying to find something in the Valley of the Kings. By 1922, Carnarvon had all but given up. And he told Carter, he said, you got one more year. If you don't find anything this year, then we're done. I can't afford to spend this much money anymore. On the first week of the digging season started in the fall in November, one of Carter's water boys uncovered a stone step. And so they began to uncover it, and they uncovered 17 steps down to a door. And Carter knew immediately that he had found something, some kind of tomb. He was a little bit discouraged because the tomb showed evidence that had been broken into, and he thought, oh boy, here we go, another tomb, another broken into tomb. But nevertheless, he covered the steps back up. He telegraphed Lord Carnarvon in England, told him what he had found, and said, if you'll get over here, I'll wait till you get here, and we'll uncover this and see if there's anything down there. So it took Carnarvon about 2.5 weeks. He had to sail on a sailing ship, a boat, over to Egypt, and then sail up the Nile River. So it took him about 2.5 weeks to get there. November 24th, 1992, they cleared the steps again. They opened up the door. They found the cartouche, which is in hieroglyphics. It was always surrounding the name of a noble. They found the cartouche of Tutankhamun. And Carter said, aha, we have found the lost tomb of Tutankhamun. Which would have been like finding Millard Fillmore's house. So they cleared the rubble away. They chiseled a small hole inside the tomb's door, and Carter placed a candle there and started peering inside. And Carnarvon, very famous scene, he says, can you see anything? And Carter answered, yes, wonderful things. And boy, did he actually see wonderful things. He saw gold tinted stuff, and he realized, I have found a tomb that has not been totally plundered. In the long run, he excavated it and took him 10 years to excavate it. Took over 5,000 items out of the tomb. Greatest archaeological find of history. Maybe some of you were lucky enough. There's been 2 exhibitions of King Tut's treasures come to America. One was in the 70s, and one was in the early 2000s. Maybe some of you out there were able to get to it. I unfortunately never was able to. I wish I would have, but it just didn't work out for me. But it's just one of those great stories. So here's a few images out of King Tut's tomb. This is leading down to the stairs, leading down the steps here into King Tut's tomb. This is Howard Carter looking at one of the inner coffins of King Tut. Now, there was actually 6 coffins. It was like a bunch of nesting boxes. And Carter had to meticulously dismantle each one of these, and then the inside was covered with black tar and pitch. It took him months to get this stuff off of it, because he knew he had to be careful, because he knew that it was a treasure. And so this is a photograph of Carter working on one of the inner coffins of King Tut. This is kind of a diagram of King Tut's tomb. This would have been the steps leading down, and this would have been what was called the antechamber. It would have been like a treasury room. And you'll see that there was all sorts of, there was couches here or beds, and there were remnants of chariots and stuff. He had a couple of Nubian card warriors guarding a sealed door, and there were boxes of stuff. These are lunch boxes here, packed with food because the king had to be fed. This was called an annex, where just kind of a bunch of rubble and treasures, but it all had to be cleared out. They finally busted through this door. It had been resealed, and they found the burial chamber. And it was in here that he found a huge gold coffin, sarcophagus, that had 6 inner layers of coffins in it. And this is where King Tut's mummy was found. And then later they found another room called the treasury room, which had a whole bunch of treasures in it. That is a kind of a thing that held his canopic jars and some of the ritual things. That's solid gold, by the way, folks, as was his inner coffin. Just unbelievable treasures. This is a photograph. There were over 2,000 photographs taken. And by the way, these are colorized photographs. And I chose these because I want you to see what it would have looked like to Howard Carter and the archaeologists that were excavating this. And you can see each one's got a number, and they would have meticulously went through here and taken these things out and cleaned them up and recorded them. And like I said, it took over 10 years to do this. And this is all gilded gold. That's gold up here. This chest is different things. This is one of the outer sarcophagus inside the tomb. And you can see the burial chamber was painted. And you can see the Nubians standing outside the door, and they busted through here. And this would have been where the sarcophagus was. And there are 6 coffins within this. This is the 6th one, so it would have been 5 inside this. And that would have been gilded gold, and within them were different layers of coffins till you got down to one that was actually solid gold. This is one of the necklaces that was draped over Tutankhamun, a gold and precious stones, scarab beetle, which is very sacred to the Egyptians. So just absolutely a beautiful piece of artwork. This would have been his throne. This would have been a wooden throne that was gilded with gold and had all sorts of different diagrams. You can see this would have been Tutankhamun and his wife Akhenaten. And this would have been where he sat as Pharaoh. And this is one of those Nubian warriors carved that guarded his basically his throne room. This is the solid gold kind of ritual thing that was found in the back room. And this thing is solid gold. I mean, it's just, I can't even imagine what it's worth. It held some of the different treasures and the canopic jars and some of the things like this. All these now are housed inside the Cairo Museum in Cairo, Egypt. And I find it unbelievable that they have in the past let some of this go and actually taken it around of exhibitions. It's amazing to me that they actually have done this, because you can only imagine the wealth associated with these things. This is one of his chariots that was taken out. They were dismantled, but they put them back together. And again, they're gilded gold with all sorts of precious stones on them. And remember, folks, King Tut was a nobody. He was a nothing. So again, if he had this kind of stuff in his tomb, we can only imagine people like Ramesses II and Amenhotep II and Thutmose III and Hatshepsut, what their tombs must have housed. It would have been unbelievable. Now, everybody knows about the curse of the mummy. And, this was kind of a made up thing, but it was made up for a purpose. Carter actually made this up on his own. There was no curse inside the tomb. He made this up. Why? Well, number one, Carter didn't. Well, my dad would have said he didn't suffer fools. You know, he absolutely was not a very pleasant person to be around. He didn't want to be bothered. He had a job to do. He didn't want reporters. He didn't want all the politicians. He just wanted everybody to leave him alone, and he wanted to do his job. And so he thought, maybe if I scare people enough, they'll leave me alone. So he made up a story about a curse and said, you know, there's a curse inside the tomb, and you know, people are in danger that go inside the tomb. And it went worldwide, became a public sensation. In fact, there were a few individuals that died rather suspicious deaths not long after the tomb was opened. Most notably, Lord Carnarvon himself, the benefactor. He died within 5 months. How he died is it's not suspicious at all. What happened was he got a mosquito bite inside his hotel room in Cairo. And rather than let the mosquito bite heal, he shaved or had himself shaved. I seriously doubt he shaved. Had himself shaved like a lot of rich people did every day. The thing got infected and he died of blood poisoning within a few days. Remember, folks, this is days before antibiotics. Today, you know, if you got, you know, an infection, you just call your doctor and say, hey, I need a round of antibiotics, and they prescribe it and go down to Walmart, pick it up, pop a few pills, and you're fine. Well, that was the days before, you know, antibiotics. Result was he died. And it was like everybody said, oh my gosh, he died because of the curse. And there were other suspicious deaths and rumors. The story goes that Carnarvon's favorite dog, who was named Isis, by the way, reportedly died the same night at his English manor, place called Highclere, at the same time as his master's death. I don't know if this is true or not. There's also a story that in Carter's hotel room that night, that he had a pet canary and a cobra got inside it and ate the canary. Now, that doesn't scare me, but the very fact that you had a hotel room where a cobra could get into it would scare me. You know, that heck with the curse. I wouldn't want to be around the room where a cobra could get into it. There was another archaeologist that had been associated with the tomb, and Carter had sent him a little gift out of the tomb, one of the little individual pieces of treasure. And the day he got the treasure, that night his house burned down. And there was also an incident in 1929, which was about 7 years after the tomb was first opened, that Carter's secretary died, and it was a man. Very suspicious death. It was ruled a homicide. He was died of smothering. So again, folks, there are some incidents that make one believe there might have been a curse. But remember, there's no real curse involved. Carter made this thing up. Carter himself didn't die until 1931, and 1939, and Carnarvon's daughter, who was present at the tomb throughout the whole thing, she lived in 1980. So, you know, there's no doubt that there probably wasn't any kind of curse, but you know, Hollywood and the newspapers. This is Lord Carnarvon. By the way, this is his mansion, Highclere, in outside of London. Maybe some of you recognize this. I'll bet you there's some fans of Downton Abbey listening to me out there. And if you ever watched Downton Abbey, this is the house that Lord Carnarvon ruled, and this was the feudal estate that he had. And they used that as a backdrop for the actual, you know, Downton Abbey scenes. And some of the scenes inside, they filmed inside. Some of the interior scenes were filmed also, like the library and some of the big rooms in the Downton Abbey were used as a backdrop for the drama series. Wonderful series if you haven't seen it, but most people probably didn't realize that it had a connection with King Tut's tomb. By the way, I've watched all the Downton Abbey series, and if you remember that the Lord of Downton Abbey, he had a pet lab dog, and the name of that dog was Isis, just like Lord Carnarvon's dog was. So, of course, they made movies, The Mummy with Boris Karloff. I can remember as a young child watching Frankenstein and The Mummy in the movie theater. And man, I thought that was the greatest thing I'd ever seen in my life. You know, you got Boris Karloff draped on in linen, walking around, and you know, I mean, it was a big sensation. You know, the opening up of King Tut's tomb. Well, King Tut died before he could have any children, and so that necessitated a new dynasty, and that became the 19th dynasty, started by his vizier I. He tried to marry his wife, Akhenaten. She wouldn't have anything to do with it originally. Remember, I told you the story that she wrote to the Hittites and asked the Hittites to send her a son so she could marry him and unite the thrones. And the Hittites did, in fact, send her a son, but I intercepted him and had him killed. So he ended up marrying Akhenaten anyway. So there was a long line of pharaohs in what was called the 19th dynasty. Without a doubt, the most famous one was Ramesses II. Ramesses II is the pharaoh that most people for years assumed was the pharaoh of the Bible, of Moses. So his dad, Seti, and Ramesses II were the most famous. They fought large battles at Kadesh in Canaan, beat the Hittites for rule of the ancient world. And this is Ramesses' mortuary temple here, and this is the inside of Seti's tomb. I'm kind of rushing here because we're running out of time. A little bit about Ramesses II, most powerful king of the New Kingdom, and I mentioned he beat the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh and kind of made Egypt the superpower of the world. But after he died, it was a downhill slide, folks. You know, the Egyptians just were never the same after Ramesses II died. And again, there's some reason to believe he could have been the Pharaoh of Moses, even though most historians now favor Amenhotep as the actual Pharaoh of Moses. I'm kind of running through this because, like I said, I'm running out of time. Ramesses ruled for almost 70 years, outlived almost all of his children, and left a legacy of building projects, which included the rock temples at Abu Simbel and his Ramesseum, which I showed you a minute ago. And he had 9 different pharaohs take his name. In fact, in case the 19th dynasty is often called the Ramesses dynasty because of his name. This is the temple of Amun-Ra at Abu Simbel. And remember, I told you the story about this. They had to carve these things up. They dammed up the Nile to make the Aswan lake. And they had to move these things 60 foot up the mountainside. So they had to carve them out and literally move these big statues up the side of the temple, up the side of the mountain, so they wouldn't be inundated by the lake that they built. So bottom line is, after Ramesses, the Egyptians went downhill. It took about 1,000 years, long time, but they were never the same. Constant warfare over 1,000 years, droughts, other powers like the Assyrians and the Persians and Alexander the Great, and then the Romans came into power. And Egypt maintained its pharaohs and maintained its country, but they were never the same again. They were not the big powers they had once been. By the way, the last pharaoh of Egypt was Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. And we're going to talk about Cleopatra when we get to Rome. Her and Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. There was a love triangle going on there, and it was quite the story. And we're going to talk about it when we get to Rome. So that's it for Egypt. Next week, we're going to shift gears and move to the Mediterranean Sea and start talking about the Greeks. The Greeks had such an important legacy towards the Western world. We are, to some degree, what we are in the Western world because of the Greeks. I mean, I cannot overemphasize how important they were to the historical legacy of the Western world. And so we're going to start a study of the Greeks next week. There's not so much about the Bible when we study the Greeks, because I'll be honest with you, this was a period of time when the Second Temple was going on, between about 500 and about the birth of Christ. And there's not a lot of connection going on within the Bible, but the Greeks, we have to talk about them because absolutely they had such an important part in Western history. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I had to kind of rush through it towards the end here, but like I said, I'm running out of time, and I know they're going to cut me off in a minute. So I will let you go. I hope you have a good week, and we'll start the study of Greece next week.
So you can't answer any questions now, can you?
I can add, yeah. Wayne,
Okay. Well, I was just wondering if those other tombs have all been robbed, what in the world do you think happened to all of the loot in there?
oh, they probably melted most of it down.
Okay.
They probably melted all the stuff down so they could have to go, made it into coins or whatever. I mean, but yeah, I just can't imagine. I mean, it just blows my mind to imagine what was in some of these tombs. I mean, it would have been just,
my goodness.
well,
Yeah.
beyond compare.
Uh-huh.
So good question, Donna.
Well, and we watched all of Downton Abbey, and as soon as you showed that huge palace, that estate there, we recognized it. But I didn't make the connection about his lab being named Isis, but I remember that now.
He may be.
Okay.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah,
So
thank you,
interesting.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in today.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.